We continue now at the top of Daf Chav Chesam and Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 28b. This daf is sponsored by David and Ariella Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or a daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, how do we know that by a machsheves chutz lizmano, let's say during the avod of the carbon, the Kohen has in mind to consume the carbon outside of the proper time, so that's pigul, and there's a punishment of kares. And if the intention is to consume the carbon outside of the proper place, that's a disqualification, but that's not a situation where you'd be liable to kares. How do we know to make that distinction? What is the source for these halachas? And the Gemara in the previous summit quoted Shmuel. Shmuel says it comes from a combination of two psukim, and right now Abai is in the middle of explaining which two psukim Shmuel is referring to. We're referring now to two psukim that talk about the carbon being eaten late by Yom HaShlishi. There's the shorter pasuk which is in Parshas Kedoshim that the Gemara referred to as the pasuk in Kedoshim Tiyu. That's the shorter pasuk, and then there is a longer pasuk as well. And so the Gemara now continues and explains, Imeino inyan l'chutz lizmano. If you don't have to apply that pasuk to chutz lizmano, Teneu le'inyan chutz l'mekomo. Instead, you apply it to chutz l'mekomo. And the idea over here is that the shorter pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim is not necessary because we already have the longer pasuk that comes earlier, and so therefore the shorter pasuk is not talking about chutz lizmano. It's talking about chutz l'mekomo. And Rashi explains, Meino inyan le'inyan machsheves chutz lizmano, if that shorter pasuk in Kedoshim Tiyu is not for machsheves chutz lizmano, because that's already addressed. So Taneu le'inyan chutz l'mekomo, so instead you apply that pasuk to chutz l'mekomo. So we have one pasuk by chutz l'mekomo, and one pasuk now by chutz lizmano. Upigul dekra aricha. Now the word pigul in the longer pasuk, that Tzav Esaro, and that's the longer, earlier pasuk in Tzav, lo tidrashe l'chutz l'mekomo. That's not talking about chutz l'mekomo. Elakule kra b'chutz l'zmano. That entire pasuk is talking about chutz l'zmano. Hilkach mimenu a chutz l'zmano kai, and therefore the word mimenu in that pasuk is going on chutz l'zmano. V'chitema hachanami kares ksiv desamach le v'ochlav avono yisa. Now maybe you will say that it says over here also, it says kares, it says v'ochlav avono yisa. Hahu benosor mamish mesukam. That part of the pasuk where it says v'ochlav avono yisa, which is talking about kares, that's actually talking about getting kares for actually eating nosar. Kedem efarish v'yazal, as the Gemara will now go on to explain. Uchedei shelo tomar shneihem b'mashma, and in order that you don't say that both are included, mi'et rachmona v'ochlav. It says in the pasuk v'ochlav dahainu miyuto. V'ochlav is a miyut, it's an exclusion. Midaloksiv v'ochel, it doesn't say v'ochel. L'mu'ute chutz l'mekomo d'le'el minei. That comes to exclude chutz l'mekomo, which is said earlier, meaning to say you have an exclusion that we only apply kares by nosar mamish. We don't apply kares by chutz l'mekomo. And again, the earlier pasuk, that pasuk is talking about chutz l'zmano, so that pasuk is referencing pigul and kares by a case of machsheves chutz l'zmano. And we will take a look at the full longer pasuk. It says again, V'im ha'achol yachel mibsar zevach shlomav bayom hashlishi lo yeirotza hamakrev so lo yichoshev lo pigul yiyah. This whole pasuk now we're saying is talking about a situation of machsheves chutz lizmano, which is pigul. V'hanefesh hocheles mimenu avonotisa. That's the mimenu that Rashi is referencing. Means to say mimenu in this particular case, the case of machsheves chutz lizmano. That's where we say it's pigul and there's kares. That would not apply by machsheves chutz l'mekomo. And the Gemara continues and explains, as Rashi just said, Umiyet rachmona gabi nosar. There's an exclusion. The pasuk has an exclusion by nosar. It says in the pasuk v'ochlav avono yisa, as Rashi said, v'ochlav is an exclusion. Lemu'ute chutz l'mekomo. That comes to exclude chutz l'mekomo. Taking a look at that full pasuk, v'ochlav avono yisa ki es kodesh Hashem chilel v'nichreso hanefesh hahi me'ameh. The pasuk mentions kares, and again we're saying that that's an exclusion. It's going to apply to nosar mamish, but it is not going to apply to a machsheves chutz l'mekomo. And the Gemara continues and asks, Ve'ema v'ochlav avono yisa zeu chutz l'mekomo. Why don't we say that when it says v'ochlav avono yisa, that refers to machsheves chutz l'mekomo, that there is kares? V'lemu'ute nosar mi kares. We should say the exact opposite. Maybe it's to exclude nosar from kares. Why do we apply the kares to nosar and exclude chutz l'mekomo? And the Gemara says to that, Mistabra nosar havale l'ukme b'kares. It makes more sense to say that nosar gets kares lemigmar avon l'chutz lizmano, to learn out gzer shavav avon from chutz lizmano, the domile bezayin beis, because it's similar with the acronym Zayin Beis. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Adarabah, the Gemara says, well, on the contrary, Chutz l'makomo havalei l'ukmei v'kares. We could say the opposite argument. Chutz l'makomo gets kares. L'migmar avon l'chutz l'zmano d'dami le b'mikdash. We can say that we can learn the Gzeir Shava of avon to chutz l'zmano. There's a similarity over there with the acronym of mikdash. And Rashi explains, V'ema v'ochla v'avono yisa chutz l'makomo. Why don't we say that v'ochla v'avono yisa is really going on chutz l'makomo? The solak mine, which is what we were just talking about, kayu chidei shelo tomar in mikra yotzim midei pshuta, will go on what we just finished talking about, which is chutz l'makomo. And in order to say that the pasuk should not leave its simple explanation, v'af noser b'mashma, it's also talking about noser. Unihi develo yerotza lesson. Now, granted that you can't say lo yerotza applies to noser. This we mentioned on the previous Amud, that if somebody eats the carbon late, you're not going to say retroactively that the carbon is disqualified. Avol b'kares ise, but you could still say that there's kares, and lohachi miyet, and that's why there's an exclusion. V'yochlav, it says v'yochlav demashma echad v'lo shnayim, that only one of the cases gets kares, lamayit noser mi kares, to say that noser is excluded from kares. In other words, what Rashi is explaining is that when the Gemara asks that v'yochlav avono yisa is going on chutz l'makomo, and that we'd be excluding, we'd use the v'yochlav again as an exclusion, it's a limitation, we'd be excluding noser. The idea is that noser could have theoretically had kares. We know that noser would not have retroactively made the carbon disqualified, but there could have it potentially been kares by noser, and so therefore v'yochlav avono yisa is saying that machsheves chutz l'makomo gets kares, but we exclude noser from kares. And then the Gemara said, Hachi Garsin, and here's the proper text, Mistabra noser islach le'ukmei v'kares. It makes more sense to say that noser is the one that gets kares. Lemigmar avon l'chutz l'zmano, to learn a gzeir shava avon to chutz l'zmano. The dami le b'zayin beis, because there's a similarity there, which we have the similarity through the acronym Zayin Beis, which again Rashi will explain. Adarab, but then the Gemara asks on the contrary, chutz l'makomo havalei l'ukmei v'kares. Maybe chutz l'makomo should get kares. The migmar avon l'chutz l'zmano, the dami le b'mikdash, because you can make the gzeir shava to chutz l'zmano because it's similar with the acronym of mikdash. And Rashi says, V'hachi perusha. Here's the explanation of the Gemara. Noser havalei l'ukmei v'kares. Noser should get kares. The migmar avon. We have a gzeir shava of avon. Shemalamed kares al chutz l'zmano, which teaches us kares by chutz l'zmano. She'ein kares mafurish bo, because the pasuk that talks about chutz l'zmano, there it doesn't actually say kares. Ela nesias avon amurabo. All it says over there is the phrase nesias avon, the carrying of the sin. V'limin mikan b'gzeir shava, and we're going to use a gzeir shava over here to teach the hacha ksiv nesias avon, because here it also says nesias avon umefarish kares, and it does say kares. So you have this nesias avon, which we can apply to machsheves chutz l'zmano and say there's kares by machsheves chutz l'zmano, which is in fact what we say. Hilkach im mukmis lei lahai benoser. Therefore, the point over here is as follows: if you say that this pasuk over here is talking about noser getting kares, so then ikol amilfe l'gzeir shava shaper, then you can do the gzeir shava to teach back to the case of machsheves chutz l'zmano, the damu hadadi, because you can only make a gzeir shava if they're somewhat similar, and here they are somewhat similar. How are they similar? B'shnei devarim, the acronym, as we said, there's the acronym Zayin Beis. They're similar in two ways. B'shnei devarim halalu sheshneim nifsalim bizman. Number one, they both have to do with time. Noser has to do with the fact that you're eating it past the proper time, and of course, machsheves chutz l'zmano is an intention to eat it past the proper time. Zeb bizman mamish, this actually is past the time. V'zeb b'machsheves zman, and the other one is talking about intention of the improper time. And the Beis, when it says Zayin Beis, the Beis stands for Ushneim Noagin Bebama. Both of these disqualifications of having intention of the improper time or eating it past the proper time, they are both halachas that apply by a bama, by an altar that is outside of the Beis Hamikdash. How do we know that? Kedetanan mePerek Basra. That's a Mishnah in the last parak. D'chipurach v'neilif avon mitomas basar d'chsiv v'nasa Aaron es avon hakadoshim. Because when we ask that we should learn out avon from Tomas Basar, it says over there, V'nasa Aaron is avon hakadoshim, ma'alahalan la v'lo kares, just like over there it's a negative commandment but not kares, afkan la v'lo kares, so to over here it's a negative commandment and not kares, amrinon, so then we say, mi noser havalei l'meilaf, we should learn from noser, the dami le b'zayin beis, because again it's similar in this respect, in Zayin Beis, this acronym in terms of Zman and in terms of Bama. Avol imuk But the point over here is, let's say we say that this kares is not nosar, but this kares is actually chutz l'makomo. So ki gamart le chutz l'zmano minei b'gzeira shava. If you're going to learn chutz l'zmano from there with a gzeira shava, uparchinon le v'neilif avon mituma, and then you're going to try to refute the gzeira shava by saying, why not learn avon mituma? So leka litrudze michutz l'makomo havale l'melef t'dami le b'zayin beis. You can't then answer back that chutz l'makomo, it's good to learn from there because it's similar in zayin beis, because that's not true. Ta'ain psulo bizman, because man doesn't apply by chutz l'makomo. That's talking about outside of the place, not outside of the time. V'yeino noig bebamas yochid. Also, there's no concept of chutz l'makomo by the altar of a private individual. She'ein sham mechitzas, because there are no mechitzas over there, and so that's why it's important that it be similar in order to be able to learn the gzeira shava. So essentially, the way Rashi is understanding the Gemara is saying that the reason why we apply kares by nosar is in order for the gzeira shava to work from nosar to machshavas chutz l'zmano. Otherwise, if it's not similar in some regard, you can't make that gzeira shava. But then the Gemara asks, but what do you mean? If we say it's chutz l'makomo, there is some similarity between chutz l'makomo and chutz l'zmano as well, and that similarity is found in the acronym mikdash, b'mikdash. Mem is machshava because they're both intention. Kuf is ktsas, dalet is dam, and shin is shlishi. And Rashi explains, chutz l'zmano v'chutz l'makomo, if you're going to try to find the similarities between chutz l'zmano and chutz l'makomo. So first of all, shneihem psulin b'machshava. They both have to do with intention. That's the mem. V'mchishev b'miksaso nifsal kulo. Also, if you have intention on part of it, the entire thing becomes disqualified. That's the idea of ksas. U'shneihem nifsalin ba'avodas hadam. Both of them are also disqualified. It all has to do with having these wrong intentions during what's called the avodas hadam. The avodas hadam refers to the shchita, the kabbalah, the conveying of the blood, the throwing or the sprinkler or the application of the blood. Uvishneim nemar shlishi, and also by both of them it says the word shlishi. So there are comparisons, and so therefore you would be able to make the gzeira shava and not try to make the gzeira shava from tuma. Lafuke tuma, that's different than tuma. De'eno psul machshava, that has nothing to do with machshava. V'im nitma mechsaso, just because part of it is tamei, lo nitma kula, it's not all tamei. V'yeshna la'achar zrikas damim, it applies after the zrikas damim. It's not only during the blood avodos. V'lo nemar bo shlishi yiseir, there is no shlishi over there that's extra. By chutz l'zmano and chutz l'makomo, there is an extra shlishi for a gzeira shava. By both of them, it says again by mashlishi v'samach levim he'achol yachel v'lo boy lemichtav shlishi. It doesn't need to say shlishi again. And the Gemara now continues with another way of deriving that again by machsheves chutz l'zmano it's pigul and there's kares, and by machsheves chutz l'makomo it's just a disqualification. But there is no kares because again you cannot learn out from what we said above, because you could equally have said, as we said above, that there is kares by machsheves chutz l'makomo, because dami leiva mikdash. Again, chutz l'zmano and chutz l'makomo are similar in those four ways. So you equally might have been able to say that when it says v'ochla v'avono yisa, it means to say that there is kares by chutz l'makomo and not by nosar. And so the Gemara therefore says, Elo Amar Rabbi Yochanan, rather Rabbi Yochanan says, the source, the derivation is as follows. Tani Zavdi Bar Levi taught Asya Kodesh Kodesh. We learn it out from Kodesh Kodesh. Means as follows. Ksiv hacha, it's written over here as Kodesh Hashem Chilal V'nichrasa. It says Kodesh Hashem and it says V'nichrasa. Uksiv hasam, and it's written over there V'sarafta as a nosar bo'esh, that you're going to burn the nosar bo'esh. That pasuk goes on to mention the word Kodesh as well. The full pasuk over there is V'mivaser mibsar hamiluim min halechem araboker V'sarafta as a nosar bo'esh lo yeyachel ki Kodeshu. So again it says Kodesh over there. Mal lahalon nosar, just like over there the context of the pasuk is nosar. Afkan nosar, so too over here, when it says as Kodesh Hashem Chilal V'nichrasa, that is talking about nosar. Umiyet rachmona gabe nosar, and again there's an exclusion by nosar. V'ochla v'avono yisa, that's the exclusion of the pasuk that we mentioned above. V'ochla v'avono yisa l'mu'ute chutz l'makomo mikares, to exclude chutz l'makomo from kares. And taking a look at the full pasuk, again it says v'ochla v'avono yisa, that's the exclusion, and that pasuk says ki es kodesh Hashem. Again we're making the gzeira shav of kodesh, ki es kodesh Hashem chilal v'nichrasa nefesh hahim me'amel, and therefore we're applying the kares in this pasuk again to nosar specifically, and not to chutz l'makomo. But the Gemara continues and asks, "So my chazis dekra aricha b'chutz lizmano." How do you know that the longer pasuk is talking about chutz lizmano? And again, that would mean that machsheves chutz lizmano is pigul and gets kares. Ushlishi the parshas kedoshim tiyu chutz l'makomo, and then the shlishi in parshas kedoshim is chutz l'makomo, and that does not get kares. It's only nosar that gets kares. But epochano, I could say exactly the opposite. I could say the longer pasuk is chutz l'makomo, and the pasuk in parshas kedoshim is chutz lizmano. And the Gemara answers to that. Mistabra makes sense to say aricha b'chutz lizmano, that the longer pasuk is talking about machsheves chutz lizmano. The Gomar avon minosar, because again we're learning that gzeira shava avon from nosar to chutz lizmano. The damile b'zayin beis, and as we said, nosar and chutz lizmano are similar in two ways. Zayin beis, meaning they're similar in terms of zman, and they're similar in terms of bama. But the Gemara says, Adarab, on the contrary, you could say exactly the opposite. Aricha b'chutz l'makomo, you could say the longer pasuk is talking about chutz l'makomo. Ushlishi the kedoshim tiyu, and the shlishi in parshas kedoshim b'chutz l'zmano, you should actually say that's chutz l'zmano. Mishum the domi le samche, because since it's similar, since chutz l'zmano is similar to nosar, that's why it's right there in parshas kedoshim. That's right next to where it's talking about nosar. The common midland say on the contrary that we're excluding machsheves chutz l'zmano from kares. And so therefore, again, you can't really say that these are the two psukim that serve as the source. And so the Gemara continues, Elo amar Rava, rather Rava says, Kulu mikra aricha asyan. Everything is actually derived from that long pasuk, meaning the idea that chutz lizmano is pigul and gets kares, and the idea that chutz l'mekomo is a disqualification, but there's no kares, it all comes from that long pasuk, Tichsiv, as it's written, He'achol yachel. Again, that's the long pasuk, He'achol yachel. The full pasuk again, Vim He'achol yachel mibsar zevach shlomav bayom hashlishi lo yerotza hamakrivo so lo yechoshev lo pigol yev hanefesh ocheles mimenu avona tisa. Everything is going to now be derived from that pasuk, and there's a double language in that pasuk. It says heyachol yeyachel. So we learn as follows: b'shtei achilos hakosim medaber. The pasuk is talking about two achilos. Echad achilas adam. We're talking about a person eating from the carbon. V'echad achilas mizbeach, and also the fact that the mizbeach consumes the carbon. That's what we learn from heyachol yeyachel. And then it says in the pasuk, we're now darshaning each part of the pasuk, mibsar zevach shalamav. It says mibsar zevach shalamav, mashlomim mefaglin umispaglin. Just like the shlamim, it causes pigul and becomes pigul. Afkol mefaglin umispaglin. So too we're talking where things cause and become pigul. And shlishi, when it says the word shlishi, zeh chutz lizmano, that's a reference to chutz lizmano. Lo yerotza, when the pasuk says lo yerotza, kehartsoas kosher, like the kosher is accepted, kein hartsoas posel. So too when we're talking, so too is the same halach applies when the disqualified is accepted, meaning umah hartsoas kosher ad sheyakrivu kol matirav. Just like when you accept a carbon, all the matirim have to be brought properly. Af hartsoas psul. So too when you have a disqualification, what it means to say is, let's say you have a machsheves chutz lizmano, you have a wrong intention, you're intending to bring it outside the proper time, ad sheyakrivu kol matira, but everything else has to be done. In other words, all of the avodos have to be completed, and then we will say that the machsheves chutz lizmano renders it into pigul. And then the pasuk says hamakriv, the one who offers it. That means bahakrava hu nifsal. It means to say that it becomes disqualified through hakrava, through being offered. V'eino nifsal b'shlishi, but it does not become disqualified on that third day. That's the idea that retroactively you're not going to have a disqualification if it's consumed late. Oso bezevach hakosim medaber. It says oso, we're talking about the carbon. Ve'enu medaber bekohen. We're not talking about the kohen being disqualified. And lo yechoshev, the pasuk says lo yechoshev. And Rashi explains, Kula mikra aricha asyan, it's all really being learned out from the long pasuk, zel chiyav zel iftor. The case of machsheves chutz lizmano is chayav kares. The case of machsheves chutz l'makomo is potter from kares. And kediyolef le Rabba b'rei shmaitin. This is really the same pasuk that Rabba tried to derive this from at the beginning of the sugya. That was in the previous amud. The Gemara rejected Rabba, had a question against Rabba's derivation on the previous amud, but now we're going to solve that issue. And again, now we're darshaning each part of this pasuk. B'shtei achilos, we're talking about two achilos, meaning shemachsheves shteyen poselas, that the machshava by both achilos creates the disqualification. Tahalakamon v'machshava muki leitana, because again we're going to say later on, we're talking here about having a wrong intention. V'lo ba'ochel bayom hashlishi. We're not talking about somebody who actually eats the carbon late on the third day. Now, what are the two achilos that we're talking about? Echad achilas adam. We're talking about achilas adam and achilas mizbeach, meaning again during, let's say, the shchita of the carbon, you have the intention to either eat the carbon outside outside of the proper time, or for the Mizbeach to consume the carbon outside of the proper time. The Loshna Chishev Lechol Lamachar, doesn't matter if his intention was to eat it tomorrow. Loshna Chishev Lahaktir Emurin Lamachar, doesn't matter if his intention was to burn the sacrificial portions tomorrow. Pigul, it is going to be pigul. Mibesar Zevach Shlamav, the pasuk says Mibesar Zevach Shlamav, Hikish Zevachim L'Shlamim. This is a comparison of Zevachim, of these sacrifices, to Shlamim. Ma Shlamim Yesh Behen Mefaglin, just like by Shlamim, you have among them that can create pigul, V'yesh Behen Mispaglin, and those that become a pigul. Meaning to say, Shahadam Hu HaMefagel, that the blood, by the blood avodos, that creates the pigul, V'habasar V'hoimurin, and then what's happening is you're having intention during the blood avodos, let's say by the shchita, for example, you're having intention to consume the basar, the meat, at the wrong time, or that the mizbeach is going to consume the emurim at the wrong time. Those are hamispaglin, those are the mispaglin. That's what we see by shlamim. So af kol, so too, sheyesh bo mefaglin u mispaglin pigul. The point over here is, only by karbonos, where you can have both mefaglin and mispaglin, is there pigul. No higbo. Only then we apply pigul. What does that come to exclude? Where do we find karbonos where you don't have mefaglin and mispaglin? Yatsu minchas kohanim, that would exclude the carbon mincha of kohanim. Uminchas kohen mashiach, also the mincha of the kohen gadol. Uminchas nesachim, and also the minchas nesachim. Shehem matir nes atzmam ve'ein b'hem shirayim. You don't have over there like a kometz that's like a matir for the rest of the carbon in those cases. You really just bring the entire mincha. Lehispagel, so you don't have lehispagel machmas avodos matireim. You don't have a remainder that becomes the mispaglin because of the avod of the matir. Shein pigel noeg ben, and therefore there's no halacha pigel by these various carbon minchas. Lo yerotza hamakriv, and then the pasuk says lo yerotza hamakriv mashma azrika lo tehei zrika zu meratza. It sounds like we're saying the zrika is not meratza. Shma mino da'ad sheyizrak hadam machsheves pigel telu yovo medis. The point over here is that until the zrika happens, you really don't have pigel yet. The pigel is suspended waiting for the zrika. Nizrak hadam, once you finish the blood avodos, the last of the blood avodos is the zrika, because again, the blood avodos are the shchita, the slaughtering, and then you have the kabbalah sadam, the receiving of the blood, and then the holacha, the conveying of the blood, and then the zrika, which is the application of the blood. So you're waiting, you have, let's say there's a machsheves pigel early on by the shchita, you still have to complete those avodos. Nizrak hadam hukva hapigel, only when you've actually thrown the blood is it established that this carbon is now pigel. Lo nizrak hadam, but let's say you didn't actually throw the blood, you didn't complete the blood avodos, kagon shenishpach, for example, let's say the blood spilled, so then batal hapigel, then there is no pigel anymore, it's nullified. T'chsiv be hartsa, k'tchsiv gabe kosher, because again, you have the word hartsa, just like you have hartsa, that there's a certain point in time where the carbon is accepted as a kosher carbon, which is after the zrika, that's also true in terms of rendering it pigel. Ma hartsa as kosher lo kari be hartsa le bezrika, shu sof arba avodos hamatiros, just like hartsa as kosher, meaning it's not considered a completed carbon until the end of those 4 avodos, the blood avodos, af pigel eno kavua, at sheyizrak adam she sof kol matir. The same thing is true by pigel. It's not going to be considered established as pigel until the zrikas hadam. B'hakrava hu nifsal hashta yolef dev'machshava hakos medaber. Now this part of the Gemara, where we talk about hakrava, that causes the psol, we're saying over here that it's the machshava that this pasuk is talking about, the intention of eating it in the wrong time, not the actual eating it in the wrong time. Shemechashe b'shas hakrava lo ochla b'shlishi. He's thinking during the hakrava to eat it on the 3rd day. V'eno nifsal b'shlishi. It doesn't become possible by eating it on the 3rd day. And b'hakrava lo chishav al manas kain, meaning if during the hakrava, the offering, the person didn't think that he's going to eat it on the 3rd day, v'yachal mimenu b'shlishi, but he actually did eat from it on the 3rd day, ein hakarba nifsal amafrei. Again, as we said, the carbon doesn't become disqualified retroactively. Tahachi midrash lo yerotza hamakriv lo tezrikaso meratza im al manas kain hikrivo. Again, if it's on that condition, that's what, through that intention, that's what creates the disqualification. Also, bezevach umedaber ve'eno medaber bezoveach. Then the Gemara said, we're talking about the zevach, the carbon, and not the zoveach, the one bringing it. Kolomar means to say, v'shelo tomar dahai hamakriv lav lahachi hudasa. Don't say that the word hamakriv is not for what we just said above. Elalomar lach shahakoin hamakrivo lo yechashevod bekahuna. Maybe what we're saying is, if somebody does this, let's say he has this wrong intention, then the Kohen himself, who has the wrong intention, becomes disqualified. V'yifso milchayin, he cannot be a Kohen anymore. Maybe you'll say that's what the pasuk means. Lakach nemar oso hazevach below yechoshev. The carbon is the one that's not accepted over here. Ve'ein haKohen below yechoshev. It's not the Kohen that's not accepted, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tet. Ches Amud Aleph.